Hey everyone, welcome to another video. Today we're going to talk about the complete story of Jean Grey, written by Louise Simonson. But before we get started with the story, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel if you find anything interesting within the comics covered here, for with your help, this channel can grow and improve. This issue opens up with Jean Grey knocking on death's door. But see, death is nothing new to her, for she has been there many times before. And unlike the others who had died during the Hellfire Gala, she knows time is running out for herself, but despite what she believes is going on, she chooses to focus on what is certain, and from her perspective, she is certain that all of this is her fault. Because there had to be something she did wrong to set these events in motion. So with her life slowly fading away, Jean thinks hard and tries to remember, for if she could understand what happened, then maybe she could fix everything. But the only problem is, it's hard for her to think, because in her current state, her mind is broken, which ultimately left her memories scattered. And with each memory being represented by an image, Jean has to be certain to choose correctly, for a different answer could yield a different outcome. So the best way to determine where it all went wrong is to start at the very beginning, because her mutant life was born in death. Because when her powers first manifested, it nearly overwhelmed her when her friend was hit by a car. And as a consequence, she nearly was killed by the surge of power. So as a repercussion, Charles offered to block Jean's out-of-control psychic abilities, which was just one of her emerging psi powers. Now when this happened, should she have said no? Later, when Charles offered her a scholarship to his school, should she have accepted it or should she have just stayed away? And even when old Hank arrived from a terrible future asking them to travel through time to save the world, should they have refused or should she have helped? And because they chose to help, they were lost in time, and their presence made things worse, until a young Cable from the future convinced them to return to their own time, to the very moment they left, and told them to forget the future and everything they did. So with that said, at that moment, she agreed with Cable and wiped everyone's mind. But what if that was the point in time where everything went wrong? What if she made sure they didn't forget? What if they needed that knowledge? Because the old her was certain their future would be abysmal, and it still could, unless they act. So unlike her past self, Jean chose a different path, a different route, and chose to ignore Cable's warning and retained everything they learned. Now this meant they knew who was going to be good and who was going to be bad, alongside how certain events would have played out. So with everything set, there was still one person they had to deal with, and that was Charles, because eventually he would look into their minds and the secret would be out. But see, Jean already had planned for that scenario, because she took it upon herself to block their minds for the time being. So with Jean's plan in full effect, she was dead set on controlling what she could, in order to make it work. So with that said, the team skipped over to the danger room, and let's just say, the danger room was hardly a challenge after what everyone had been through. In fact, it was cut off almost just as soon as their training session had begun. Because apparently, Magneto was attacking Manhattan. But see, Charles was fully aware that Jean already knew that, because just by looking at her, Charles realized that Jean already removed his blockers. Which he thought was a huge mistake, but a mistake that he was unable to alter because Jean was already at full strength and full control. But somehow, Jean was able to ensure Charles that her having her full range of power would better position them to stand against evil. So with their arrival in Manhattan, Magneto jumps into his speech about how humans should cease their attacks on their superiors or face destruction. Because in this world they have the power, and because they have the power, he was planning on getting revenge for his people, so with his power over metal, he quickly snatched up the members of the X-Men, using the metal suspension cables from the bridge. So with the team wrapped up, Jean quickly unleashed her telekinesis and knocked his helmet clean off his head, and within seconds, the battle was over. But before she delivers the final blow, Jean informs Magneto that what he is doing will hurt all the mutants in the long run. The fear he spreads, his talks of annihilating humanity, will lead to the destruction of them all, because it will make people afraid, which would make them fear and hate the mutants. So with that said, Magneto goes on to call the X-Men the Stooges of Charles. Which this version of Jean had to break the bad news and say not exactly, because Charles would never do what she is about to do. Because during her life, Jean has seen the terrible places that Magneto's mania will take them, and because she knows that she cannot stand by and allow that to happen. So with a devastating psychic attack, Magneto was sent crashing into the ground, and almost immediately Cyclops went to check on their opponent, only to be shocked at what he found. Quickly, Cyclops asked Jean what did she do to him, in which she replies by saying she made him a blank slate because they all see where his hatred will lead. And because of that, it would be better this way for everyone. And as for the witnesses and the bystanders, Jean proposes to just change their perception using her powers because Charles does it all the time. So with her power, she controls the spin and shows the people what she wants them to see. Because from her point of view, they were the good guys, so she decided to let them be the good guys in the open, because maybe the secrecy is where they went wrong. So with that said, everything went according to plan and the news was on their side, and the X-Men under Jean's rule were seen as the heroes. So following their success, the team ended up moving out of Charles's mansion and into a condo of their own, using Angel's inheritance. And while there, Jean pursued her own mission, a mission to change the evil mutants' minds through small and subtle tweaks. And the way she was able to do it was by using a Cerebro made by Beast. Now this wasn't just an ordinary Cerebro, no, this was an improved Cerebro, because it was created to locate emerging mutants much more easily, which should mitigate the danger when their power manifests. And to make it better, the device is also portable and more sensitive. It was so sensitive, it could register the first quivers of power emergence, which should give them enough time to step in and keep them safe. And with said device, Jean was single-handedly able to stem the tide of hate and effectively change the world's viewpoint on mutants. So with everything going in their favor, Jean puts the helmet on, and instantly she gets her first hit. Now the hit was of a young kid with extremely strong psi powers. So with the race on, the team quickly set out to help the young mutant in need, but by the time they arrived, it was too late, for the kid's power effectively exploded the building in which he lived. So with the place of flame, the team without hesitation jumped into action and tried to save whoever they could. And while they search, Jean Grey stumbles upon the kid, the source of the blast. And when she gets there, the worst was already upon him, for he was already at death's doorstep. So within his final moments, Jean did all she could to ease his passing all the way up to his final breath. So with the child gone, the news reporters appeared on the scene, and through some more mental manipulation, Jean was able to convince the onlookers that the explosion came from a gas leak, not an emerging mutant. Now this event was the first major event that would lead to the destruction of this X-Men team, because members like Bobby and Beast weren't comfortable with her decision. Because from their perspective, she was dead set on doing things her way, regardless of what the others believed. Now Jean was so far consumed by her own self-appointed mission that she volunteered to rewrite their minds to feel better about the lie she created. So following that event, Trask showed up on the news with proof that undermined Jean's cover story, for he revealed that the explosion wasn't from a gas leak, but rather from an emerging mutant. And because of that smoking gun, Trask called for a task force of Sentinels to be created to bring the mutants under government control, and the so-called X-Men would be the first on his list. So with that said, the Sentinels arrived on the scene, and with extreme prejudice, they destroyed the X-Men's new home in a coordinated attack. So with their base of operations gone, the team had to do whatever they could to save every mutant possible. So in a crazy plan, they decided to gather all the mutants they could think about before Trask and his Sentinels could get to them, even if it meant kidnapping children. Because of their time in the future, they already knew some of the mutants they would need. So with that said, Jean used Cerebro to find them. And find them she did, for Kitty Pryde was first to be taken against her parents' will by Jean Grey using her psychic ability to make them believe that they wanted to send her to boarding school. And see, Kitty wasn't the only one, because Sam Guthrie and Danny Moonstar were also on her list. So with Jean spinning out of control, Bobby confronts her and tells her that she is acting like mutants are more important than regular people, which was something Bobby couldn't get behind. So with these kids in their control, they couldn't afford to keep them close to them at all times. They needed somewhere to hide them as they collected more. And because of that, they needed Charles's help. So with few options at their disposal, the team returned to the mansion, only to see Charles playing chess with a newly rehabbed Eric. Because after Jean's mental assault on Magneto, Charles was only able to partly recover his cognitive mental state because she did a number on him the last time they met. So with that out there, Charles goes on to tell her that she is acting a lot like Eric these days in the way she is moving. Now this wasn't something Jean wanted to hear, because she stated that she wasn't a terrorist like him, because she doesn't use her power to kill. Which was a funny thing to say, because even Eric could see that given enough time, she would eventually do so. So with Jean Grey's morality in question, she quickly turned over the kids to Charles, because she knew that he could keep them safe. So with that done, Charles went on to ask the rest of her team if they was okay with her leadership. And in no surprise, Bobby was the first to speak up alongside Angel. So with that said, the two members of the X-Men decided to stay with Charles rather than continue down the same road with Jean. So with the team effectively split, Jean, Cyclops, and Beast proceed to leave to continue her crusade. So following that event, we pick up sometime later with Beast meeting with a reporter by the name of Trish on top of a rooftop in order to convince her not to write a particular story. Because according to Hank, the article she would be writing would lead to fear-mongering because the kids that went missing were mutants that hadn't manifested their powers yet. And to make things worse, Trask took a good number of the children for himself to build a mutant army, an army that he could control. So as Hank continues to try to persuade her not to write the story, Jean Grey arrives on the scene and uses her power to mind wipe her, because according to Jean, Trish was not writing a single thing. So with Hank's friend turned into a vegetable, he immediately went to her side to do whatever he could to help her. So with his friend out of commission, Hank was completely convinced that she wouldn't do the deed. But with Jean's psychic ability, she disagrees. So with anger building up within Hank, he lashes out by saying Bobby was right, Jean has become a monster. So with that said, Jean snapped and proceeded to attack Hank with a burst of psi energy, knocking him out as well. So with both Trish and Hank out cold, Cyclops emerged from the shadows completely shocked by what he just witnessed. And because of that, Cyclops chooses not to stand beside her, because at this point in the story, whoever Jean is unable to control, she just turns into a vegetable. So with the telepath on her own, Jean is left to wallow in her own thoughts. Because if Jean was completely honest with herself, she was fully aware that she had become a monster. Despite how hard she tried, despite how she tried to restart everything, she still managed to do everything wrong. Because if she wanted to kill a snake, then she would have to cut off its head, she would have to cut off the anti-mutant propagandists, the exploiters, the users, the manipulators, the noisemakers. You have to stop the leaders to make the rest afraid. But the only problem was that she was just one person, she was alone, or at least that was what she thought. Because from deep down inside, she felt it from the beginning, but she ignored it like so many things, but it waited and remained calm, until now, until she called for it. And it answered, for Jean and the Phoenix is one person. So as the fire consumed her, the power she needed was now hers. And systematically, she began her reign and took out each target one by one as she swept through the lands. So with Jean's power being hard to miss, Charles and the rest of the team had to do something about it despite her motives being pure. Because at this point everyone including the highest power in the land is beginning to buy into the anti-mutant agenda. Because at this point, Jean isn't even trying to hide her energy signature. So with no other options before them, the team armored with Cerebro helmets set out to confront the all-powerful Phoenix. So with the fight on, Charles tries to deal with her by psychically talking her down, as the rest of the team attempts to keep her from making a deadly mistake. But unfortunately, no matter what they did, and how hard they tried to stop her, their abilities were still not enough to stop her overwhelming power. Because in a burst of primal rage, the omniversal creature let out a wave of death that consumed all her friends before her, killing everyone she tried to protect. So with only flames around her, Jean stood alone regretting everything she had done, because at this reality everything turned out wrong, so that option no longer existed to her. So with Jean and the Phoenix remaining, she turned her attention to her next option, because at this point, she believes she knows where it all went wrong. So with that said, this issue of Jean Grey comes to an end. So with that issue over, we transition over to issue number 2. And when we get there, this issue opens when Jean chooses wisely to forget about the future and to return to the past and let her story play out in an unbroken line until she ran into yet another pivotal moment of decision-making. And that was when the new X-Men returned from space in a shuttle during a solar flare that could kill almost anyone. Now during this time, Professor X was psychically incapacitated, but despite that, they weren't worried for the shuttle had a shield containment room that was safe inside until shrapnel damaged the shuttle's autopilot. So if the rest of them were to survive, one of them would have to face a certain death, which includes mentally piloting the shuttle into Earth's protective atmosphere. Now, when this first went down, things played out a lot differently. In the original timeline, an argument ensued which led to Jean Grey using a psychic attack on Cyclops. And then when it came to her and Wolverine, she eventually pulled her rank on him, due to him being the new guy on the roster. So with the ball in Jean's court, she quickly exits the shuttle and pilots it all the way down to the surface. all the way until she was unable to withstand the radiation any longer, and with her last breath, she cried out for help right before the shuttle crashed into the bay. Now luckily, everyone survived the impact, and as for Jean Grey, she emerged as the Phoenix, triumphant but not quite herself. Now, at the time, none of them knew she was possessed by a symbiotic power that was drawn to passion and thrived in the darkest corners of her soul and reveled in destruction. But see, that was only their first encounter. So with that said, on the very next page, we jumped back to Jean Grey at that moment, before everything went wrong, before the shuttle went down. And unlike her previous choice to do it herself, Jean decided to allow another member to take the lead. Jean allowed Wolverine to steer the shuttle. Now, in all honesty, Wolverine was a great choice to do this, given the fact that he had a healing factor that would allow him to survive the radiation of re-entry. So, while Wolverine took the cockpit, the rest of the team settled down in the shield compartment and waited. So with everything set to go, Wolverine opens his mind to Jean. And by doing that, she was able to see through his eyes. Jean is able to see the dials and even the controls as Earth approached them. And then, just like Jean remembers, the flares hit at full force, and quickly, she realized their shields might not be enough. So with chaos breaking loose, Cyclops took the opportunity to stand before everyone and reveal his feelings openly to Jean Grey, because at that moment, Scott truly believed they all were going to die. But regardless of his confession of love, Jean had to jerk herself away, which caused Scott to fade into the background. For her focus had to be entirely on Wolverine, in order to keep them all alive. Now, as their rapport deepened, Jean was able to learn more about Wolverine, more about Logan. And through that connection, his life flashed before her eyes as the radiation intensified and his healing factor struggled to repair himself. And during all of that intense interaction, she is able to see when his powers first emerged, when his claws first broke through his skin, and to her surprise, his claws were not made of adamantium, but rather, it was made of bone. But that wasn't all she saw, for she also saw his military service. She saw him back in World War I, as well as World War II. Which begs the question, how old is Wolverine really? But see, as she continued to dive through his thoughts, she ended up running into a blank wall, which ultimately was a hard stop in his memories, for the radiation is more than his healing factor can take. And because of that, she was losing him, but unwilling to let things end like this, Jean grabbed hold of his mind and started to push harder, adding her will and strength to his. And through their combined strength, the block within his mind shattered into thousands of pieces. And beneath it revealed terrible traumas that were even hidden from him. Because within that dark place, they stumbled upon a secret research facility in Canada. A clandestine military operation called Weapon X. And in that place, Logan was their prisoner, and the mad scientist, better yet, torturers, bonded the adamantium to his bones and strived to eradicate his humanity. But eventually, Logan ended up escaping with such anger, such destruction, and such courage. Until he eventually came to the X-Men in the hope of finding a safe haven, though he didn't know he needed one. Jean also seen that he doesn't trust the rest of the team yet, but she doesn't hold it against him. After everything he'd been through, how could he? But somehow, through some kind of miracle, he trusted Jean enough to let her into his mind. And in there she saw that he was willing to die for all of them, but especially for her. So with the shuttle hitting the bay, everyone emerged alive, with the exception of the man of the hour. So with things looking dire, out of the water emerged Wolverine. But just like Jean Grey in the original timeline, Wolverine was not alone, for within him burned the flame of the Phoenix. And as he emerged, his claws spread throughout his body, creating devastating spikes, for he is the Phoenix, rising from the ashes of his past, and he was dead set on making the ghosts that hunted him pay. So with a fiery intent, Wolverine shot across the sky, ready to make those who harmed him pay. For all his memories were back and was ready to be avenged. So, with that said, we fast forward back to the X-Mansion with Professor X, pretty much talking to the entire team, and while talking, he brings up how they did a good job and how they were able to escape unnoticed from the crash site. And because of that, he thinks it would be a good idea for them to go on a vacation to Ireland and lay low until things cool down. But he failed to mention Wolverine's sacrifice and anything to do with him. Now this right here pissed off Jean Grey to the point where she decided to defy Charles's orders and refuse to go to Ireland in search of Logan. And with Cyclops being who he is, he volunteered to go along with her just for the fact to be close to her. So with that out there, we transition over to Canada, and while we are there we get a dialogue from Jean saying, how she always loved Scott since they were kids, but since all this has been going on, she hardly gave him a second thought, despite him bearing his soul to her. And to top that all off, whenever she closes her eyes, it's Logan's face she sees, and his voice she hears. So with that out there, as they approach the lab, Cyclops brings up how despite Jean seeing the carnage Wolverine left behind, she still loves him. And because of that, he knows he stands no chance. And that is when Jean responds by saying, "It's not like that, she just understands why he did it, because the people he is killing are the same people who put adamantium on his bones and try to turn them into an inhuman, anti-mutant killing machine. And they are also associated with groups like American Dark Ops, Trask and his Sentinels, as well as other anti-mutant fascist and hate groups around the world. And because of all that, when Logan first escaped, he killed the leaders, but that didn't stop them." And the crazy part about this whole thing is that Jean believes that Professor X knew about this. And maybe that was the reason why he recruited Wolverine, but when Wolverine transformed into the Phoenix, Charles decided to cut his losses and moved on. So with that established, when they looked inside the lab, the two saw where Logan was tortured at. And now to make things worse, the place where Logan was stored is now home to several more replacements. For Logan was just the first to be placed in those vats, because the mad scientist was dead set on creating an anti-mutant army. An army that would never come to be if Wolverine has anything to say about it, because following that, we see Logan completely cutting through everyone in the lab. One by one he sliced everyone down, with no problem at all. So with adamantium spikes flying across the lab, no one was safe from Wolverine's fury. So with the bodies piling up, Cyclops yells out to Jean that this slaughter has to stop. But despite his cries, Jean could only tell him that Wolverine somehow managed to shield his mind from her due to him being in a berserker rage. In fact, he was so consumed by his rage that he didn't even realize that Jean and Cyclops were in the room. So with the situation going bad, Jean somehow managed to break through his mental blockers and reach the man within the beast. So in the moment of clarity, Wolverine makes a request of Jean, and that request was to end his life. So with the request made, Scott took it upon himself and unleashed his optic blast on Logan. But to his surprise, the fire within Wolverine was able to block the optic blast midway. And with his mission fulfilled, the Phoenix ended up leaving Wolverine in search for a new host, a host with a passionate hunger, a host like Cyclops. Because the Phoenix is a being of emotion and strength and reacts to its host manifest will. So it was only right that Cyclops would have been its next host, given his strong emotional feelings towards Jean. So with his visor broken, Scott and the Phoenix looked at Jean as she is, for the Phoenix is not a being of logic, for it thrives on Scott's feelings for Jean. And because Cyclops didn't want to be used by the Phoenix, much like Wolverine, he too asks to be killed. So with Jean unable to kill Scott, she laid a kiss upon his lips, but at that moment Wolverine also placed his claws through Cyclops' back as well. And at that moment, Jean saw the fire, leaving Scott and Flo back to Logan, answering his needs. Because within seconds, Logan used that flame to consume himself, and in a glorious flame, he burned himself to ashes, and all Jean could do was bear witness to the deaths of not just one, but two of the men she loved the most in the world. So with Scott and Logan gone, Jean could only reflect on her decision, for at the moment, Wolverine seemed to be the logical choice because he was able to survive the radiation and survive even the impact. But one that he couldn't survive was the Phoenix itself. So with that scenario hitting a dead end, Jean was forced to admit that her taking on the Phoenix was the best option that could have been done. So if that is not where everything went wrong, then Jean is forced to look somewhere else. Now with that said, issue number 2 of Jean Grey comes to an end. So with issue number 2 in the bag, we transition over to issue number 3. And when issue 3 opens up, we see Jean talking to Madeline Pryor, saying how every time she deals with her, everything goes to hell. Because if Jean was being completely honest with herself, she would have to admit that she has no idea what is going on. Because one minute she is within her thoughts, and the next minute she is inside of a desert with chains binding her down. So with things not adding up, Jean eventually realizes that the chains that is around her neck actually belong to Madeline. For in this situation, Madeline's memories were holding back Jean Grey for a change, because for as long as Madeline could remember, Jean's memories shackled her. So with that revelation coming to light, Jean for some reason could hear Exodus and Hope's voice, because back in Immortal X-Men issue number 16, both Hope and Exodus found Jean's body broken and in a trance. And through reading her mind, Hope finds out that all the mutants who walked through the gate were in the White Hot Room. But anyway, getting back to the story, Jean points out how she has no idea what is happening and how everything that is going on is not fair. But that is when Madeline responds by saying, "You thought I would fight fair." Because Madeline would never forget what Jean took from her, and for that, she will never forgive her. Nor would she ever forget about the disaster they called Inferno. So following that, Madeline then goes on to provide a quick recap of the event by saying, Mr. Sinister, determined to possess a child from Scott and Jean's lineage, used Jean's cells to force grow Madeline in a tube. And when she awoken, she was basically an empty vessel used to marry Scott in order to produce a child by the name of Nathan Christopher. But shortly after having Cable, Scott discovered that the original Jean was still alive, so eventually Cyclops ended up leaving Maddie due to misinformation. So with Madeline cast aside, she found refuge with demons, and together they started Inferno and then planned a demon invasion. And as things continued, one thing always remained the same, and that was everyone around her always ended up using her. But that is when Jean responds by saying, they were told both Madeline and Christopher have died, but with a lot of hard work, Scott eventually found baby Cable asleep in a cryogenic chamber. But shortly after finding him, they were attacked, which gave the demons the opportunity to slip in and steal the child. So with Scott and Jean distracted by the battle, they missed the demons completely. So with that said, Jean considered, what if the demons never got away? What if they kept possession of Christopher? So in that moment, Jean told Scott to aim at the demon that took Christopher, and with a well-placed shot, Cyclops shot the demon out of the sky as Jean used her telekinesis to gently lower the baby to safety. So following that, Madeline states, saving the child and removing him from the continuity may not necessarily work. Because a do-over isn't possible, because her maternal instincts would not kick in, and she will not forget about her rage. Because at this point all she cares about is power. But just for entertainment, Madeline was open to see how things would play. And play out it did, because the first thing Madeline of that time did was kill the demon that failed her, and upon its death an unexpected guest arrived. Out of the shadows, Sinister appeared on the scene, and with a snap of his fingers, Madeline was in chains with Daddy Dearest going on, for he loved to gloat. And during their interaction, Madeline discovered that she was indeed a clone. Now with Sinister deep in her brain, the demons looked on in shock as Sinister dismantled the Goblin Queen. So with the situation getting rough, Madeline demon allies took it upon themselves to step in and stop the mental abuse. So within seconds, two demons flanked Sinister and prepared to kill him, but with a commanding tone, the Goblin Queen ordered them to stop, because in her words, Sinister belonged to her, and with her frightening power she burned Sinister into ashes. Now with that threat out of the way, one of the demons tells Madeline to hurry and help him recapture her son, so they can sacrifice him to open the portal between Limbo to Earth so they can rule together. But unfortunately, Madeline had other plans in mind, because she wanted to rule alone. So once again Madeline exercised her power and proceeded to kill everyone in the room. So with no one else left to oppose her, she has now truly become the Goblin Queen and her reign is about to begin. Now, following that, we transition over to Scott and Jean Grey, arriving back to the city, and when they get there, before them is a giant hellish landscape because Limbo is now open. So as the two navigate through the new skyline, demons from all around attempt to take down their aircraft. But due to Scott's expert control, they were able to make their escape. Now, despite all the chaos that is going on, Jean and Scott still have no idea about what just transpired. All they know is that their main priority is to protect Christopher. So with their aircraft landing on their ship, the two thought they were in the clear until Madeline arrived. Now, this right here came as a massive surprise to Jean and Scott. Because up to this point they were under the assumption that Madeline was killed because they believed they saw her body alongside DNA evidence. But that is when Madeline responds by saying dealing with DNA is Sinister's expertise. So with that out there, she proceeded to demand them to hand over Christopher because shortly all of them were going to die. And the first to fall was going to be Scott, because within seconds, Madeline was able to complete incinerate Cyclops. But before he was no more, he yelled for Jean to save the baby. And save the baby she did, because within an instant, Jean took the baby and asked Madeline, why Christopher, he's innocent. But see, to Madeline, it didn't matter whether he was innocent or not, all that mattered was that she created him for a purpose, and because she was intending to use him as she saw fit. Because like I said before, his death is the key to connecting Limbo to Earth. So once it is open, Madeline would be able to control both. So with Maddie fed up with asking, she decided to go on the attack, so within seconds, she let out a massive fire blast, only for Jean Grey to stop it dead in its tracks. So with the first wave blocked, Jean managed to find a safe place to store the baby, so she could focus on the enemy before her. But before she can resume her battle with Maddie, the Phoenix arrived on the scene with an offer. Because the Phoenix tells Jean Grey that it was responsible for bringing Madeline back to life, so it could do the same for her. Just as long as she accepts the Phoenix Force as it is, both the darkness and the light. But due to Jean's standfast conviction, she rejects the offer because she refuses to be used the same way Maddie was. So with her decision clear, the Phoenix took her at her word and replied by saying, "Then you will die, Jean Grey, for every choice is yours to make." So following that exchange, Madeline rips right through her defense and started to absorb Jean's energy. But luckily for our hero, she was able to break free and send Madeline flying to the opposite side of the ship. So with the battle intensifying, Madeline touched the ship and with her abilities, she was able to transform it. Because, according to her, she was able to control every atom that made up that boat. Now with the molecules as an extension of herself, she was able to turn it into a tidal wave and swipe through the city, because there was more than one way to rule the world. So with Jean Grey completely unable to fight back against Maddie, she ended up stopping the mental simulation and admitted that she once accepted the Phoenix Force power. And when she didn't want it, she sent the power to others. So with the constant rejection, the only thing she got in return was constant death. In fact, all her choices up to this point ended in death and destruction. So with all avenues ending in a dead end, Jean goes on to ask what else she could have done. And at that moment, many versions of herself replied by saying, how should they know? She is the one in charge, because she was the one who created this mess to begin with. So with that said, issue number 3 comes to an end. Now following the events of issue 3, we pick up in issue number 4. So with that said, the final issue of Jean Grey opens with our hero surrounded by several versions of herself, several versions that are all blaming the main Jean for their shortcomings. Because according to them, Jean was responsible for all the mutants' deaths, including her own. Which is something our Jean Grey couldn't truly understand, because according to her, she has died many times before, so that couldn't be the real reason why her variants are angry. So with that out there, other variants then go on to say, they are fragments of her past, fragments of her nightmare, and this is really just a product of imaginary stories she has been telling herself. So ultimately, none of this is real. Or at least, it isn't supposed to be real, but in the White Hot Room, everything is real, in its own way. So with Jean trying to unravel everything, she started to have a conversation with one of her variants. And during that interaction, one of the variants states she saw a dozen realities, and based off of everything she saw, she was ready to erase the X-Men's memories of the future until our Jean Grey stepped in during issue number 1 of this story. And with all those changes, she used those memories to forge another terrible future, a future in which she bought the Phoenix into. And by doing that, she made her who she is, a killer who killed everybody all because she didn't trust herself to leave well enough alone. Because she had to meddle in where she wasn't needed. But that is when our Jean tries to stand up for herself by saying, the X-Men were all dead and she had to know if there was anything she could have done to save them. But following that, her variants responded by saying you're confused because she is the one who is dead. And when it comes to if she picked the right choice or not, that is an easy answer. Which is yes, up to this point Jean has made all the right choices. And in her attempts to redo everything, all he managed to do is inflict pain upon the world. So in all honesty, all Jean had to really do is trust her instincts, and trust herself. And at that moment, the Phoenix flies into her chest. Now, following that, Jean Grey goes on to say, she needs to consider the ramifications, to think things through. But that is when another variant of Jean goes on to say, why did you force that nightmare upon her? Because in issue number 2 our Jean changed things to where both Cyclops and Wolverine died before her eyes. So with that bit of news out there, our Jean apologized for everything. She said her decision was based on arrogance as she stood in the ashes of the X-Men wondering if maybe she was wrong. Because according to our Jean, she thought maybe it would have been better if someone else was in charge. Maybe it wasn't all up to her. But unfortunately, the reality is that the Phoenix had hidden within her body while she healed, and while in there, it took on Jean's aspects in her name, it destroyed worlds, it rode her anger, your needs, as far as was possible until your true will asserted itself, and stopped it, and supposedly lost your life in the process. But see, that wasn't the end, not by a long shot, because eventually they found her true-bodied cocoon beneath the sea and awoke in it. And with her life back in her hands, she was returned to Scott and all was restored. But regardless of everything being fixed, Jean still saw it as bad, because of everything that happened afterwards. Because the impulse of arrogance didn't work, so ultimately she turned to logic, but from that perspective, the reality was much kinder to her at least, but when it came to Madeline Pryor, things were not so great. Because while Jean was gone, Madeline had everything she wanted and needed. She was actually preparing to marry Scott as a blank slate with everything open in front of her. But once Jean Grey re-entered their life, Maddie was cast aside and left to her rage. And through that rage, she became the ruler of all the demons, which gave her free reign over the techno-organically transformed world. And in the end, both of them got consumed by their rage to where the world almost ended. But even there, Jean could have stopped her by calling on the Phoenix for help, but again Jean second-guessed herself and questioned her priorities. And because of that, so many people were never the same. And from Maddie's perspective, Jean was at fault, because in the shuttle, the Phoenix Force came to her, but Jean rejected the Phoenix and so it came and found Maddie in Sinister's cocoon. And once there it brought death even as it breathed life into her body. Because at the end of the day, Jean didn't rewrite that scenario and make herself accept the Phoenix offer, but rather she just shuffled the power onto Wolverine and then to Scott. Because of course Jean believed taking on the Dark Phoenix, tainted as it was, with the death of millions, couldn't have been a sound answer either. But see, if she did take the power on, then Madeline would have never received any power, she would have never lived, Cable would have never been born, and she would have never ruled Hell. Effectively, Maddie would have never existed, which begged the question, would they have been better off if she would have cut off the source of her power? And strangely enough, the Maddie that stands before her remind her that love is what she is all about, so with that realization dawning on her, the Phoenix appeared back to let her know that she has been creating worlds to prove that she had no choice. Creating nightmare tales about how the Phoenix and Jean, if together, only brings death and destruction. Pretty much painting the picture that she was damned if she did and damned if she didn't. Because all paths lead to death in the stories she wanted to tell herself. So with the reality sinking in, Jean started to wake up and remember the Hellfire Gala. The party where everything changed, the party where Orcus attacked. She remembers Orcus, anti-mutant fanatics, attacking and how she tried to protect everybody. But ultimately, she failed to do as intended when Moira came into the picture and jabbed a knife right through her back. Now with the shock hitting Jean, she started to wonder, why did the Phoenix not come to her at that moment? But that is when the Phoenix responded by saying, "How could I? I'm as dead now as you are." Because like Jean Grey, the Phoenix only exists here in the White Hot Room, which is a nexus between all Phoenix hosts and the Eternal Flame. And while there, the Phoenix is divided into small bits and pieces. So basically, it is inactive, but the White Hot Room is still the heart of the Phoenix, even if it is broken at this current time. So with that said, when Jean first awoke here, she asked out loud, what did she do wrong? And which the Phoenix responds by saying the answer to that question is nothing. So throughout this entire comic run, the Phoenix has been trying to show her and teach her that she must trust her own instincts. For her impulses were true, that she was right to do everything that she has done up to this point. But the truth is, even though Jean Grey did everything right, other forces were still at play, so there was nothing she could do about it. So no matter what choices they make, death will always claim its reward. But not us, at least not yet, not completely. For they are not alone here, and there's one more thing we can do together. And that is to save their friends, because on the next page, we see Jean Grey returning to her feet with the Phoenix at her side in the White Hot Room before Apocalypse, Hope, and Exodus. And once there, Jean tells Hope that everything is up to her now, but she will do all she can to help. And that is when Exodus describes the White Hot Room as a higher spiritual realm, a place of primal creativity, of ideas made flesh. So with Hope having the ability to mimic powers, Jean comes up with a plan, the only herself, Hope, and the Phoenix Force could pull off, and that is giving Hope her powers. So with a single touch, one last gambit, Hope emerged with the Phoenix at her command. So with Hope and Exodus ready for whatever, they charged her first into the fight, as Jean watched on. Because Jean is no longer the woman everyone used to know. For now, Jean is life incarnate, now and forever. And as for, if she is the Phoenix or not, who knows? Maybe they are something else, something new. But regardless of what they are, on this day, they did no harm. And moving forward, she would just follow her guts, follow her instincts, follow who she really is. And if she was being honest, she knows. This isn't over, not for them, not for their union. Not for any of this. But what comes next, be it life or death, Jean and Phoenix will face it together. So with that said, the final issue of Jean Grey comes to an end.